Welcome, I'm Dr. Robert Gladner, Medical Advisor from Medscape Emergency Medicine. Joining us today is Dr. Lewis Nelson, Professor and Chair of Emergency Medicine at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, and a certified medical toxicologist. Today we'll be discussing an important and disturbing Gen Z trend circulating on social media known as Borg, or Blackout Rage Gallon. Welcome, Lewis.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. This trend that's been circulating on social media is really disturbing. It has elements that really focus, to me at least, on binge drinking. And, talking about taking a jug, emptying half of it out, putting a fifth of vodka, some electrolytes, caffeine, other things too, is just incredibly disturbing. And teens are looking at this, parents are looking at this, and I'll let you just jump into the into the discussion.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. It is disturbing. I mean, binge drinking is a huge problem in this country in general. It's a particular problem with young people, teenagers and young adults. I don't think people appreciate the dangers associated with binge drinking, the amount of alcohol they consume, some of the unintended consequences of doing that. I mean, just to frame things, quickly, we think there's probably around 6 people a day in the United States who die of alcohol poisoning. And alcohol poisoning basically is binge drinking to such an extent that you die of the alcohol itself. You're not dying of a car crash or doing something that injures you. You're dying of the alcohol. You're drinking so much that your breathing slows and stops. You have heart rhythm disturbances, etc. It's about 2,200 people a year in the United States.
That's alarming. Part of this trend, their argument is that half of the gallon is water. Therefore, I'm fine. I can drink it, sip it, nurse it over 8 to 12 hours, and it's not an issue. How would you respond to that?
Well, alcohol is alcohol, and it's all about how much you take and over what time period. So, I guess in concept, it could be safer if you do it right. I think that's not the way it's been, so to speak, marketed on the various social media platforms. It's meant to be a way that you could protect yourself from having your drink spiked, or eating or ingesting contaminants that, from other people's, mouths when you share glasses or dip cups into, communal pots like, of jungle juice or something. But clearly, if you're going to drink a large amount of alcohol over a short or a long period of time, you do run the risk of having significant consequences of that. I mean, both just bad decision making if you're just a little drunk, all the way down to the complications you just described about alcohol poisoning.
I mean, there has been a comment made that this could be a form of harm reduction. And, the point of harm reduction is that we run trials, we validate it, and we test it. And this certainly, in my mind, is no form of true harm reduction. I think you would agree.
A lot of things that have marketed as harm reduction aren't. I mean, there could be some aspects of this. I just commented on one or two that could be considered harm reduction. I mean, if you believe, and there's no reason not to believe that protecting your drink is a good idea. So if you're at a bar and you leave your glass open and somebody puts something in it, you can be drugged. So, drug facilitated sexual assault, for example, is a big issue. That means that you have to leave your glass unattended. Tending your glass is probably fine. One of the ways of harm reduction they mention is by having a cap and having this bottle with you at all times. That can't happen. Now, in fairness, by far the drug most commonly associated with sexual assault is alcohol. It's not GHB, it's not ketamine, it's not the other things people are concerned about. Those happen, but those are really small problems in the big picture. It's drinking too much. So a form of harm reduction that you can comment on perhaps is that you make this drink concoction yourself. So it's in there. I mean, you can take that bottle, pour out half the water and fill it up with another half of water and nobody's going to know. Right. But more likely, the way they say you should do it is you take your gallon jug, you pour it out and you fill it up with a fifth of vodka. Now, a fifth of vodka is the same amount of volume as a bottle of wine. Right, it's 750 milliliters. That's a huge amount of alcohol. I mean, if you measure the amount of shots in that bottle, it's about 17 shots. Right, so even if you drink that over 6 hours, that's still several shots an hour. That's a lot of alcohol. You might do 2 or 3 shots once and then not drink for a few hours. But to sit and drink 2 or 3 shots an hour for 6 hours, that's just an exceptional amount of alcohol. They flavorize it and add caffeine only adds to the risk. It doesn't make it in any way safer. And that's true with the volume. I mean, a gallon of water or equivalent over a short period of time in and of itself could be a problem. There's a lot of messaging here, whether something's harm reduction, it could flip around to be easily construed or um, understood as being harmful. Not to mention, the idea that when you make something safer, one of the unintended consequences of harm reduction is what we call risk compensation. This is best probably describes what's called the Peltzman effect. The way that we think about airbags and seatbelts is that they're going to reduce car crash deaths, and they do. But people drive faster and more recklessly because they know they're safe, right? And this is a well described problem in epidemiology where you expect a certain amount of harm reduction through some implemented process, but you don't meet that because people take increased risks.
Right. And I think, the idea of not developing a hangover is common among many teens, 20 somethings, that, because there's hydration there, because half of it's water, that it's just not going to happen. So there's your quote harm reduction. But, look,
Yeah.
your judgment's impaired. It's day drinking at its best all day long. And then someone has the idea to get behind the wheel, and it's just these are the disaster consequences that we all fear.
Well, yeah. So there's a great example, perhaps, of an unintended consequence of harm reduction. By putting caffeine in it, depending on how much caffeine you put in, some of these mixtures can have up to 1,000 milligrams of caffeine. Remember, a cup of coffee is about 1 to 200 milligrams. So you're talking about several cups of coffee. But the idea is that you will not be able to sense, as you normally do, how drunk you are, right? And so you're not going to be a sleepy drunk. You're going to be an awake drunk. And the idea you're going to have to drive, so you drink a strong cup of black coffee before you go driving. You're not going to drive any better. I can assure you that. You're going to be more awake, perhaps, and not fall asleep at the wheel, but you're still going to have psychomotor impairment. Your judgment is going to be impaired. There's nothing good that comes of adding caffeine, except that you're going to be awake. From a hangover perspective, there's a lot of things that we've guessed at or suggested as either prevention or cures for hangover. I mean, I don't doubt that, you're going to have some volume depletion if you drink a lot of alcohol. Alcohol is a diuretic, so you're going to lose more volume than you bring in. And so hydrating is probably always a good idea, but there's hydrating and then there's overhydrating. Right. We don't need volumes like that. You drink a cup or two of water, you're probably fine. You don't need to drink half a gallon of water. That can lead to problems like dilutional hyponatremia, et cetera. So there's not any clear benefit to doing it. If you want to prevent a hangover, one of the ways this might do it is by using vodka. There's nice data that shows that clear alcohols typically, particularly vodka, because it doesn't have a lot of the congeners that make specific forms of alcohol what they are. Bourbon smells and tastes like bourbon because of these little molecules, these aldehydes and ketones and amino acids and things that make it taste and smell the way it does. And that's true for all of the other alcohols. Vodka has the least amount of that. So even wine and beer have those in them. Vodka is basically just alcohol mixed with water. So it's probably the least hangover prone of all of the alcohols, but still, you drink a lot of vodka, you're going to have a hangover. I mean, it's just a dose response curve to how much alcohol you drink, to how drunk you get, and to how much of a hangover you're going to have.
Right. And I think that's really what it's about, is the hangover, because people want to be functional the next day. And certainly there's lots of companies out there that market hangover, remedies, but people are using this as the hangover remedy, but in a way that's socially accepted. So I think that's a good point you make. So the question is, how do we get the message out to parents and teens? What's the best way you feel to really sound the alarm here?
Yeah, these are challenging issues. I mean, we face this all the time with all the sorts of social media in particular. I mean, most parents are not as savvy in social media as their kids are. Um, but you have to know what your children are doing. You should know what they're listening to and watching. You do have to pay attention to the media directed at parents that will inform you a little bit about what your kids are doing. You have to talk with your kids and make sure they understand what it is that they're getting. So we do this with our kids for some things. Hopefully we talk about drinking and smoking and sex and other things with our children, driving if they get to that stage, and make sure they understand what the risks are, and how to mitigate those risks. So being an attentive parent is part of it. Sometimes you need outside messengers to do it. We'd like to believe that the social media companies are able to police themselves. At least they pay lip service to the fact that they do. Um, and they have warnings that they'll take things down that aren't socially appropriate. Whether they do or not, I don't know, because you keep seeing things about Borg on these media sites. So if they are doing it, they're not doing it efficiently and quickly enough.
There has to be some censorship, and I think you bring up a good point. I mean, these are young persons who are impressionable, who have developing brains, who are looking at this that, if it's out there on social media, TikTok or Instagram, then it's okay to do. So, that message has to be really driven home.
I think that's a great point, and it's tough. I mean, we know that there's been a lot of debate over the liability of social media for what they post and whether or not they should be held liable like a more conventional media company or not. And that's politics and philosophy that we're probably not going to solve here. All of these things wind up going viral, and there's probably got to be some filter on things that go viral. And maybe they need to have a bit more attentiveness to that when those things start happening. Now, clearly not every one of these is viral, but when you think about some of the challenges we've seen in the past, the Tide Pod Challenge, the Cinnamon Challenge, some of these things could be quickly figured out to be dangerous. I remember the Ice Bucket Challenge, remember, for ALS, pretty benign. I mean, you pour a bucket of water over your head, people aren't really getting hurt. That's fun and good, and let people go out and do that, and that could pass through the filter. But when you start to see people drinking excessive amounts of alcohol, I mean, it doesn't take an emergency physician, to know that that's not a good thing, right? I mean, any parent could know if my kids could drink half a bottle or a bottle of vodka over a short period of time, that just can't be okay.
No, it's a public health issue. I think that's what we need to elevate it to because, ultimately that's what it impacts, welfare and safety. There, speaking of buckets, there's a new bucket challenge where unsuspecting people have a bucket put on their head, they can't breathe and then pass out. And there's been, a number of these reported and actually filmed on social media. So speaking of buckets, here's another example of dangerous types of behavior, that essentially are a form of assault. So unsuspecting people suffering injuries from young children, teens, trying to play pranks. And again, had there not been this medium, we wouldn't necessarily see the extent of the injuries. I guess going forward, the next step would be, to kind of message to colleges, I guess, that this trend really, if it's seen, it really should be some form of warnings, at least from a public health standpoint.
You probably know that education is a necessary thing to do, but it's almost never the real solution to a problem. We can educate people as best we can, and they need to know how to do things right. But at some point, we're going to need to regulate it or manage it somehow. And whether it's through a carrot or a stick approach, right, whether you want to sort of give people, sort of kudos for doing the right thing or punish them for doing something wrong, that's a tough decision to make, and one that is going to be made by a parent or guardian or a school official or the law enforcement. But somehow we have to figure out how to make this happen. And there's not going to be a single size that fits all, I'm sure, for this. But at some level, we have to do something to educate and regulate. And the balance between those two things is going to be, again, political and philosophical in its nature.
Right. And I think, the element of peer pressure and conformity in this is really part of the element. And I think, if we try to remove that aspect of it, then often these trends would go away. That aspect of conformity and peer pressure is instrumental in fueling these trends. So, maybe we can make a full gallon of water be the trend and not any alcohol in there.
We say, water's only water, but, as a medical toxicologist, I can tell you that one of the principles, one of the foundations in medical toxicology, everything is toxic, and it's just the dose that determines the toxicity. So oxygen's toxic, water's toxic, everything's toxic if you take enough of it, right? And we know that, polydipsia, whether it's psychogenic or intentional polydipsia, but drinking an excessive amount of water, especially without electrolytes, that's one of the reasons they say you should eat electrolytes. But, that's all relative as well, because depending on the electrolyte and how much you put in and things like that, that could also become dangerous. So drinking excess amounts of water, like they're suggesting, which sounds like a good thing to prevent hangover, etc., can in and of itself be a problem too.
Right. And I think we know that there's no magic bullet for a hangover. Really, that, obviously abstinence is the only thing that truly works. But
Or
until the
moderation at
research
least,
proves
right?
further. Well, thank you so much. I think, you've made some really important points. Thank you for talking about the Borg phenomenon and how it relates to society in general and what we can do to try to, affect people's perception of alcohol and also the bigger picture of binge drinking. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks, Rob, for having me. It's great. It's an important topic, and hopefully we can kind of get a handle on this. I appreciate your time.